I'm very grateful that you joined us this afternoon. This is the third panel in a series of sessions. Phil Bernstein is Vice President of Building Solutions for Autodesk. It's fair to say he's helped pioneer the application of this technology in our profession, but what I find increasingly impressive is his fidelity to the educational mission and his consistent support for programs that seek to better understand the potential of these technologies in the curriculum. Renee Chang is Director of the School of Architecture at the University of Minnesota. She's one of the few educators in the United States who has consciously sought to reformulate the professional curriculum based on the availability of these technologies. She's published highly influential essays on the relationship between building information modeling, integrated practice, and design. Also, I want to plug Renee's latest work, which is for the AIA in collaboration with the University of Minnesota. You can now see highly specific, data-driven case studies of actual building projects that employed these technologies with a critical evaluation of the technologies and contractual practices they employed in the work. This is available under the integrated practice.
I'll give the URL.
You'll see it shortly. She's going to report on it. And my colleague, Carrie Sturz-Dosick from the University of Washington, Department of Construction Management, has almost single-handedly introduced a higher level of rigor to the integration of architectural design methodology and construction management practices around the availability of building information modeling and related visualization software. She is currently directing the Sandpoint Northwest
Pacific Northwest Center for Construction Research and Education.
Boy, wow, that's why I faltered. This is a facility that permits students of architecture and construction management and landscape architecture to manipulate construction in real time, at full scale. And it's a uniquely designed lab that's surrounded by collaboration studios, which Carrie helped design and implement. Carrie is a licensed professional engineer and earned her doctorate in engineering at Columbia University. To open the question, I would like to read a passage by Paolo Tombesi that's located in this book, which I highly recommend to you, Building in the Future, Recasting Labor and Architecture, edited by Peggy Deemer and Phil Bernstein. It's a terrific compilation of diverse perspectives on the current and evolving conditions for the production of buildings in this century. I'm interested in this particular passage because I think it just says more succinctly and directly than almost anything I've read what's facing us as a profession, as an industry. So Tombesi is exploring the implication of some of these technologies in the office. But to conclude his argument, he says, in the end, however, it is up to the third component, academia, to facilitate the adoption and dissemination of a cultural paradigm in which architects may find themselves engaged in a group discussion on buildings, but also industrial systems, on spatial semantics, but also procurement strategies, on materials, but also industrial relations and training programs, on project budgets, but also project priorities. Of course, implementing this agenda requires adjusting curricula, devising teaching strategies that can expand the idea of design as an activity broader than architectural design, and providing opportunities to present design labor as an area of intellectual concern incorporating the various definitions provided in the opening paragraph of this text. As suggested, this might involve questioning the epistemology of design vis-a-vis the domains it intersects rather than treating its architectural or even fabrication creative component with blind reverence. It might also involve overcoming the cultural separation that has long beset the analysis of intellectual work in construction, possibly by revealing design's social heterogeneity and by adopting analytical instruments capable of decoding the actual value of particular patterns of work, and it could require presenting construction, management, real estate, and other enterprises that are not strictly architectural as legitimate concerns of one's professional dimension as an architect.
I guess we're each going to speak for about 15 minutes here. And I'm actually going to reflect my comments more from the perspective of someone looking from the outside of the academy in, because although my academic work is about training designers in the sort of structure of practice, my thesis here is going to be to express my grave concern that, with the exception of some of the work done by my colleagues here on the panel, we are moving rapidly toward a crisis of relevance in how we're training and preparing architects to enter into this context that Paulo asserted in the chapter that he wrote in our book. And so, just very, very quickly, I want to build an argument in sort of 4 pieces. First, to talk a little bit, not so much about technology, but about the contextual issues that the technology is creating in the environment right now that we're producing architects to work in. Secondly, what I think the potential challenges are to us as educators in addressing those questions. Then I want to talk a little bit about an idea of what I'm going to call self-disruption, which I'll get to in a minute. And then finally speculate a little bit about what the competency of our graduates might want to look like in 2016. First, in terms of the integration context, if you look at the diagrammatic evolution of various structures that are used to deliver projects, starting with the kind of traditional design, bid, build arrangement, and going all the way through to the kind of hyper-theoretical idea of an integrated single-purpose business entity that delivers a project. The red on these diagrams represent various interconnections that are beginning to occur in the relationships between the various players, whether it's cooperation agreements between builders and designers in a standard construct, or multi-party, multi-outcome agreements that are happening in the kind of what are now starting to be understood as the classical IPD models. All of these things, all of these structures suggest that the basic concept of the role of the architect, as Paulo described in that chapter, needs to be questioned. And the way he described that is this concept that he calls flexible specialization. And I know Renee is going to talk about this a little bit as well, but in our book, Paulo published this diagram where he asserts that there's actually a taxonomy of design capabilities that are necessarily applied to the problem of building design as opposed to architecture. And each one of these bubbles represents a certain set of specializations that have to be integrated in an attempt to accomplish an overall building. But if we'd drawn these bubbles in proportion to the number of calories that we invest as educators, as opposed to competencies that we're creating in our graduates, this diagram, I think, Renee, you would agree, would look sort of proportionally much different, and there would be a question of kind of relevance. And then I think so there's one question of the kind of basic structures of how projects are operating and how architects operate in that context, what design specialization looks like. And then there are some very interesting shifts if you look extrinsically in practice models, how people are actually delivering architecture. I don't know if you've seen, last week the RABA published a report called The Future for Architects. It was a kind of anthropological study that they had done, talking to a bunch of practitioners and students. And there's a bunch of interesting, pithy quotes in that article. But one of the things that I found fascinating was an assertion about a change in the structure of practice, which I think is relevant to this discussion. And basically what I've drawn here, this is my diagram derived from reading this article, but if this big blue triangle represents practice structures at various scales that vary in size from sole practitioners or small practices to kind of mid-sized practices of 10 to 50 people to the medium-sized 50 to 100 person institutional practices, and then the super practices. What was interesting about this RABA article is that the future, as asserted by both students and practitioners and clients, was that the middle range of practices, the 50 to 100 person practices, were eventually going to disappear from the landscape. And that the practice of architecture would be largely delivered by sole practitioners with limited numbers of people doing small, highly regionalized projects in one segment. What they called niche firms, who are firms that are highly specialized in delivering a certain kind of building type, or are star design architects, but that those firms would represent a very, very small percentage of actual practitioners. the broad middle of the profession is going to disappear and be absorbed into these super practices that we're starting to see growing, whether it's a Stantec, based here in Canada, which is what now, Daniel, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people. They're on the small end of the continuum. My biggest customer, AECom, has 80,000 employees right now. Their strategic plan takes them to 100,000 employees, and they just bought a construction company. So the landscape is increasingly populated by these super firms that are delivering a full spectrum of multidisciplinary integrated design and construction projects, and they're going to absorb the broad middle of the profession. And the question I think we have to ask ourselves is, who exactly are we training, and how do they fit into this big blue triangle here? The educational model is highly biased to the left. The large majority of work is highly biased to the right. And I think we need to engage in a discussion about what the actual outcomes are that we're looking at for, and how people are going to navigate through that. Now, if we look at the educational proposition as a question of sort of staying relevant, you can see some very interesting extrinsic trends that are going to, I think, influence the way we talk about this problem. So first, from a design perspective, there are lots of traditional practices out there, but this was an interesting slide that I stole from a visitor to my graduate seminar on Monday, a guy named Tom Gluck, whose father, Peter Gluck, has run an architect-led design build firm for 40 years in New York. And in that practice, when you start out as the project architect, you finish the project as the project superintendent. So you start in the office, you design the project, and they ship you off to Chicago or North Carolina or wherever they're building the job, and you become the project superintendent. So their project deliverables are in the form of subcontractor bid sets, because they are the contractor. So they formulated the design problem as designers in a way that is highly optimized for the construction problem. And in a different lecture that you've all seen me give, or many of you have heard me give, that's the nexus of the economic model that we're kind of struggling with. Meanwhile, our colleagues who are contractors are starting to adopt building information modeling massively. They are buying these tools at a great rate. Our best business in the United States right now is not selling BIM tools to architects, it's selling BIM tools to contractors, but when you survey them about what they're interested in, they have lots and lots of little prosaic problems that they're solving, like conflicts and quality and change orders and RFIs, and these are little things that don't particularly concern architects. But I've spent enough time in the technology business now that I am, there's a well-known theory that was developed by a guy named Christensen at Harvard, that he wrote in a classic book called The Innovator's Dilemma. And The Innovator's Dilemma is a Bible for those of us who are in the technology business, because it describes the business phenomenon of how big established institutions are disrupted and destroyed by people working from behind them in the supply chain curve on problems that appear to be less interesting. So one of the best examples of that is the CD, the music industry, right? The big fat music industry that was in the process of producing record albums and refused to acknowledge that singles were an interesting idea was completely disrupted by Apple, who happened to be a computer manufacturer who created the model of iTunes and disrupted them from behind. And my concern as an educator is that our educational model is likely to be disrupted by a set of construction, technology, and integrated issues. They're going to catch us from behind, and we're not paying very close attention to them. Very much the same way that the music industry said, these guys are a computer company, they don't know anything about the music industry, nobody wants to buy singles, we'll let them play in their little tiny sandbox until they came up from behind and disrupted them. And into that context, you have to look at all these toys that are available that are going to be deployed in the service of this problem, whether it's modeling technologies or cloud computing or simulation and analysis, social networking, mapping the analog world to the digital world, or mapping the digital world back to the analog world. There are lots and lots of technologies that are converging around this question, and I think we're going to have to ask ourselves whether we are likely to become disrupted by other sense of sensibilities based on how the delivery models are sort of working. So, one of the things you have to do when you see this coming is you have to disrupt yourself. You actually have to disrupt yourself. Mm-hmm. So when I went to our CEO in 2002 and said, I know, in a nutshell, I know we've made $3 or $4 billion selling AutoCAD, but I want to buy this little company called Revit because I think this is where things ought to go. We essentially disrupted ourselves before somebody else came and disrupted us. And I think if we were going to think about that same strategy educationally, you can't look at the existing structures. This is a mind map that I built of all the NAB accreditation competencies, none of which have anything to do with anything I'm talking about right now. You cannot map any of this stuff to anything that I'm talking about.
Entrepreneurship is in.
Entrepreneurship, maybe, and a very broad interpretation of
practice
integrated building practices.
And some ethics.
And a little bit of ethics. Okay, thank you. I stay on it. But you're not making me feel better right now. Okay?
There are a few.
So if you go back to first sources, if you kind of go back to first sources, you kind of realize that they're not going to be instructive here. And so you actually have to, in my view, rethink this problem of what does it mean to educate an architect, and what are the sort of sets of core competencies, and the buckets that we have to work from are around sort of the general questions of what is a generally educated person, and how is that person important as an architect? What competencies do you need to learn from adjacent disciplines like engineering, construction management, real estate, as Paul had said. And then finally, there's a high degree of carefully calibrated special understanding that needs to be gained in order for these folks to go out and competently operate. We're going through this same problem right now at Yale as we struggle with how to integrate building information modeling into our super classical Uber studio structure, with a dean who understands the problem but can't internalize it, right? Phil, go out and figure out how to do building information modeling. That's kind of what I hear from Bob Stern a lot. And so, to kind of conclude here, I think one of the ways to think about this, or a kind of business-like approach to thinking about this, is, what sorts of things do we want a graduate in 2016 to be prepared to be able to do if you stipulate that the practice context in which that person is going to enter is some strange navigation of my big blue triangle, right? And so it feels like to me that maybe there are 6 sets of ideas that somehow have to be integrated. One is the idea of whether architects should be liberally educated, and educated as people who are capable of doing synthetic thinking and therefore can move around on Paulo's bubble matrix, or in some cases operate in the center of it, right? Secondly, beyond a liberal education, is the question of design thinking, which is how do we acculturate people into the sensibilities and strategies of operating like designers. Then if you have to make the next leap into the problems of architecture, you have to get to building techniques. Then there are other large categories in which we leave largely unexplored, like leadership, collaboration, how to actually make those network pieces all operate together, different kinds of evolving practice contexts and frames that work. Since my last trip to ACSA, I've had a couple of visits to a number of institutions, and I'll say the degree of insight in this problem set that you're going to hear described up here today varies wildly from what are you talking about through I don't care to oh my God, what am I going to do about this? But there is a discussion that's kind of missing there, and then there's a whole other discussion about what the sort of methodological and process relationships are between design and the activities that are in lines 1 through 5 to finally to actual construction. And it seems to me, and I don't have well-formed ideas about this, except to suggest that we are not clear as educators what pedagogical outcomes we are looking for in response to this particular problem set, and how we think architects are positioned or superpositioned into this particular environment. If we fail to assert those outcomes, in my opinion, there are forces much larger than we are at play that will reposition architects in this context. And you can see it every day in the mergers and acquisitions department of AECOM. And so just to kind of conclude, just to take another diagram from Paulo's work in our book, in this diagram he talks about the organization of different kinds of design competencies as they align themselves around this central concept of architectural design. And what he talks about is making architecture a part of the superset of building design, and suggesting that architects are responsible for building design. And as long as we continue to subset architecture as just the black bubble in the middle of a larger problem set, then these questions of relevance that Daniel described when he read the paragraph from Paulo's piece are going to continue to be the case. And so I don't, as a practitioner and an educator, I don't have well-formed ideas about these things, but I do have a lot of extreme unease, because this is, in my view, this is a situation where, and I'll be really interested in hearing how you guys feel about this, practice is way, way ahead of the academy. The kinds of experiments that I see my customers implementing around different strategies for how design is implemented is a little bit scary. It's a, as Peggy Deemer, my colleague, likes to say, it's a theory-free zone. And we need to get some theory around this problem pretty quickly. Okay, so those are my thoughts on this topic. Carrie?
Excellent.
Okay.
All right. Well, we're going to go from the big picture problem to a very specific case example of how we are tackling education at University of Washington, at least a small portion of that.
Is this okay?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
So I wanted to introduce myself a little bit because many of you probably don't know who I am and probably are curious beyond my instruction of the class why I might be invited to sit on this panel. I have been part of research over the last 4 years, in large part funded by the National Science Foundation, to study building information modeling, collaboration, and its impact on green buildings specifically. And as part of that, I've had the great opportunity to talk to, well, really our research team has talked to over 125 industry professionals, architects, engineers, and construction management folks primarily. We've also had 3 case studies that we've had the opportunity to observe over the past 4 years. So motivated by industry innovation, motivated by things that are working well and things that are not, I come to teach the integrated studio at the University of Washington. So a lot of what I have to say, although really in the context of the studio, I am bringing the knowledge in from industry as well. All these people that Phil mentioned are experimenting in practice. So
I thought you were going to say sells software too. Thank you.
That too.
Right, so this is a case study of the collaborative educational experiences that I have done in the last couple of years at the University of Washington. I'm going to speak quickly to this slide and move on to the context of the studio, but we're really motivated, I think, in industry by the complex questions of our day: urbanization, globalization, sustainability. We need to address these with integrated teams, with people from a variety of disciplines all coming to the table and talking together. And the conversations at these tables are complex. The organization of these teams is really challenging. Who's in the room at one time? We've had some cases that up to 200, 300 people are in the room, and that ceases to then start being effective. And so what are the teams, who are the people, and what are those conversations have been an area that I'm really interested in. You might be interested in perhaps some of the other sides of the coin. Who are the other people that you're inviting to participate? And those are engineers and construction managers. We have our own pedagogical background, our own traditions, our own culture, and we, coming to the table, have our own challenges in terms of integrating with architectural education. And so these are just a fragment of some of the things that we discuss on our side of the fence. We talk about our courses being very specialized in fragmenting our knowledge. So unlike the really elegant studio model where you have this central class that brings together the concepts in a very applied manner, we don't have that model. We have a very it's been characterized as fragmented model where each of our classes are very separate from the other. We try to build one concept onto the other, but often that's not executed very well. And so in studies, engineers have found that our students have really difficulty applying theories to real world situations. And so part of my talk here is really talk in my own discipline is to say, look, this studio model is something we should be looking at as a way of helping our students apply theories to real world problems. So I wanted to let you know that you have something for your engineering and construction management colleagues to think about very seriously. So in terms of the context of integrating around collaboration, we have a juxtaposition actually of technology and talk. And if you would just push the slide there again for me, thank you. So building information modeling is really good at documenting things, really good at exchanging data and exchanging information and managing data well. Juxtaposed against that, the talk is really great for, go ahead, I'm sorry. to direct you there, to explore the unexpected discoveries. So the things that aren't on the agenda when you walk in the room, the interesting juxtaposition of, well, gosh, if we move that column, then all of a sudden our HVAC system is not working in the same way, or things that aren't anticipated when the disciplines move in. So talk is emergent and where unexpected discoveries happen, whereas technology is a little bit more fixed. And so how do we use this fixed, really good data management tool to help us in our messier talking processes? And this is kind of a larger theory of technology and talk that I've been working through that is really informing this educational process. So how do we bring the technology into the classroom? How do we bring collaboration and talk into the classroom are two big questions and actually are often in conflict with each other. So the class is actually, I should share this, the name of the class is actually of some consternation to us, because in my domain, construction management, the word integrated, or the word design build really explains the collaboration between designers and contractors. But when I say that in a room of architects, you all got very still and very scared, right? And I just did this last week too. People got really mad at me for using the word design build and for architects, because it has a bad name in industry. It's 95% construction led, and all we care about is costs, and everybody gets mad at us about that. And in addition, in the context of our department of architecture, design build means that you actually get your hammers out and you start building something. So when we try to advertise under the word design build in architecture, it both has a bad connotation, and the students all want to build something when they show up to my class, and they get very disappointed to know that it's only going to be in the computer and they don't get to get their hammers out. So that's been our struggle. And so what do we call this thing that is a studio where we're integrating disciplines? And this is the latest iteration, literally invented on the plane here. The integrated Aec Studio. Maybe this one will actually fly for both departments, we'll see. But it has three legs: sustainability, digital technology, and collaboration. So sustainability, we have for the last, I'm going to actually be reporting to you now 2 cases for the last 2 years. I'm actually in the throes of the studio at the moment, and could talk about the third, but I'll just focus on the first 2 years of the studio. The first program was the Bullet Foundation, looking to meet the Living Building Challenge with a 5-story multi-use building. At the time, this was in early stages of program. 5 architecture firms in Seattle were all going after this project, so we had intense interest in the studio. It was super fun. All these great people came to the studio and talked to our students and had really great conversations around the program and the project. The second year was Energy Learning Center, Net Zero Energy Relocatable Classroom, known as the HyperMod project by my colleague Rob Pena, and he brought the program to the class. So both programs had really high standards of sustainability goals, and we threw the students into these projects, some with very little background in any sustainable design, and some with some class background for that. In terms of the second leg of the stool, we used technologies. The first year we're actually pretty structured with our technological endeavor. We said, thou will use architecture, we'll use Revit, architecture, structure, and MEP, and then thou will bring your models together in Navisworks. And all 3 teams did this beautifully, and it was a great experience. The second year, one of the challenges we found was there was a lot of just coaching on the software tool. We wanted to get away from so much coaching and getting more into the application and use of the tools. So we let the students use whatever tools they brought in with them. We still had architecture, Revit represented, SketchUp and Rhino were both used. And one student in particular was a real Rhino fan, and so he took off on that. And then coaching them on Navisworks to bring their various models together. The third leg of the stool then is collaboration. The first year, our teams of 8 students each. Imagine 4 architecture students all together trying to design. It was quite interesting. They did a great job negotiating between themselves on the design. Dual degree students, we have a program of dual architecture and construction management students. in both programs. So they are our boundary spanners, if you will. They can speak both languages. Architects, construction management students, and some civil engineering students. The second year, we had teams of 4 and 3, trying to get away from kind of so many architects being in the same team, just to give them a little bit more design freedom. And we had this mix of studio and seminar, which I don't recommend. Dual degree, construction management, architecture, civil engineering, and landscape architecture. Some really nice work out of that second studio as well. This year, just in case you're curious, we have teams of 4, 2 architects and 2 construction management students on each team. It was a different landscape this year in terms of the people involved. So I didn't see what time I started, but oh, good. Oh, there it is, elapsing on the screen as we speak. Oh, I've been talking quickly, so we'll have time to chat. So lessons learned: managing expectations. So I wanted to bring with you a couple lessons learned from this experience. I have so much to talk about. To fit it into 15 minutes is a challenge, but I wanted to bring with me a couple of things that we've learned by trying this out. It really is an experiment. I was mentioning to my colleague, Kate Simonin is teaching it with me this quarter, and I told her, you know, maybe in a couple years I'll have figured this thing out. And she says, well, by then we'll just be changing it again. So it really is a puzzle in so many ways. So the first lesson is technology, tools, and skills. So getting away from just teaching the tool, just teaching the software. This is the button you press to make a column. This is the mouse stroke to create this line. And getting into how you actually use these tools to make good decisions, and how you use these tools to integrate, and how you use these tools to have conversations across the disciplines. That's the whole point. So getting away from the tool instruction and getting into the skill instruction has been a challenge, just because of the limitations of time. If you start with a workshop, how do you get from we push this button to make a column into this is the conversation you should be having around your passive solar design. Professional and cultural differences. I have to say that the technical aspects of the studio, teaching energy modeling, teaching BIM, teaching, those are kind of the 2 main technical thrusts, teaching design, if you will. The professional and cultural differences of the curriculums of engineering, construction, and architecture is the most significant barrier to making this work well. The students come in with incredibly different expectations and preconceptions of each other, and it's nice to see that at the end of it, those have all been somewhat broken down. One of my CM students this year said to me, he said, you know, those architects, they're just guys. They hang out and to drink beer like I do. So he kind of realized that there wasn't this other thing over there that was somebody different, but it was just a bunch of guys doing something different than he was doing. So I could say a lot more about that. I think I'll move on to work processes, design versus analysis, and team versus the individual. First, design versus analysis. So the first year we got into this, the students really got into the environmental design parts. They did research on everything from combustible toilets. No. Yeah, compostable toilets. Thank you.
Combustible.
The former idea is quite interesting on a number of levels.
Combustible toilets. I think there are such things, but they use them on like space stations. The combustible toilets to rain screens and all kinds of interesting technologies. And at the midterm, one of my favorite reviewers stood up. He's a longtime 30-year superintendent, looks and talks like it, and he stands up and he leans back. He says, you know, I'm just a superintendent, but you guys need more architecture. It's my favorite moment, and it's one of my favorite moments in the studio. You know, it's like he got it, right? He really got it. And they did. They took all that great analysis, and they took all of the research that they had done in the first half, and they sat back down and they actually did some design for 2 weeks. They put all of that research kind of in their brains and came back, just as you would in an integrated process, this circular, iterative process of integration. You're supposed to come back and come back to the design every once in a while, right? And not just kind of go off on analysis here and there, but actually come back to it. And they did that, and that's what we thought made it so successful, was we really actually got that to happen in studio, where they did the analysis but then brought it back and created design, and really, we thought, really spectacularly good design part of that. So we're very pleased. In terms of teaching, those of you, how many people in here teach studio or have taught studio? Majority of you? All single, like all not team-based, but just individuals. Some taught in teams, so a few teams. So those of you who taught in teams know how hard it is when you connect with the team always, every day in Descrit, but then how do you connect then with the individuals and how they're experiencing the process and the project differently than the team. The first year, we really just met with them in teams, and we really were missing that individual conversation. And the second year, we actually had some troubles with some individual students and didn't really take the time to pull them out and have individual conversations. And this year, finally figured it out, having individual meetings and team meetings and having some really good interventions, if you will, into the team activities, getting them to be more successful and thoughtful in their engagements. Both things happen. The CM students are waiting for the architects to do the design, and now the designers think they're done, and they're waiting for the CMs to do the design, to do the analysis. So completely engaging on both sides of the discipline coin, not getting them to just be passé about, well, that's my role and I've done that role, but really how do you engage them in conversation with each other? How do you really make the integrated activities integrated, not just share, okay, you take the design and give it to me and I'll do your cost for you, and then we submit our project. And that's what we were told to do, but how do you get them, the process of integrating, how does that happen?
It's easy, grade them on the design. That's, you give the CM students a design grade and the architecture students a CM grade, just like an IPD project.
Well, we do grade them holistically.
Shared risk and reward.
Yeah, yeah. So those are some of the challenges that we've been struggling with. I have some things that are working well this year and some things that are still challenges, and I'm happy to talk more both about what I'm seeing in practice, but also the experiences of trying to teach in an integrated studio and some of our dreams for the future as well. So I want to just end by thanking my co-instructors, Rob Pena and Kate Simonin, both architects in the Department of Architecture at the University of Washington. I want to thank the students that have been part of these projects. That's been an amazing journey with them. And I also want to thank our industry support. We've been supported by industry guests throughout. I had a cladding wall contractor come in 2 weeks ago to meet with the student teams, and it was pretty awesome. He comes in and he said, "Let me tell you how we build curtain walls." And so the architects were like, "Whoa." But it was really fun. So we have more to do, more work to do, but we're headed in the right direction. And I want to finish my leaving comment is, I went to a presentation last week. The architect presenting said, to go from talk to doing, you have to start with doing one thing. So when you leave this conference, I want you to go back and I want you to do one thing. Invite a construction management faculty to your review. Invite someone to lunch. Do one thing that makes a difference in the way that you want to change your work. Thank you.
I've been interested in BIM as a representational media, and then later in IPD as a process in the profession over the past couple of years, and seen the extraordinary rapidity of change. I was very involved with the AIA's efforts in these, first on the Board Knowledge Committee, then in what they now then called Ipd Committee, and then now the CIP group, and so all the various iterations of what integrated practice was going to be and how BIM would relate to things. And there were a lot of case studies that were being done as kind of narratives, which was the kind of way that I had always done case studies when teaching in my class, with as many images as possible and a lot of narratives. And over time, even though there was only a handful of truly integrated projects, they did kind of all start to sound the same to me. And as I was reading through them, I would get sometimes a little bit lost on, what was it that which projects was it that people were talking about. So we decided to do a very different approach to the case studies. This is the end of a 4-month-long process. We've just been funded for an additional year. So what you're seeing here is a 4-month effort, which is why there are no real conclusions, because we're still trying to figure this out. We focused a lot on the early parts of what people were doing in terms of setting up the culture of collaboration. We, had a lot of information on how projects were after, at the end when the project was done, trying to reproduce how people remembered how things had happened. And it was a lot of very positive, oh, this was great, we'd do it again, but they would forget some of the struggles that happened over the course of building up the culture that needed to create the collaboration. So we decided to choose projects that were in early parts, early phases of their design, so that we could follow them over time and try to record things as they were going through them. So we released this in February. It is on the AIA website, and I'll give you the URL at the end here. It's an interactive PDF, and there's also a static PDF. The way that we set this up, just to give you, this is in the segment here that's up in here about the study. So one thing I wanted to clarify is that there's an IPD definition that the AIA has been using. It occasionally gets revised, and the group that Ryan works on, the CIP group, often will wordsmith this and kind of pass it by various industries to kind of get this, but this is the latest definition. We had to actually define it for our own report to try to sort through the information we were getting. Primarily our information was coming through interviews, although we had extensive surveys. And so we were sorting through some of this stuff, and I think Paolo's the kind of invisible panelist here today, because he was really instrumental in defining this aspect of what we were looking for, whether there were what we called markers, kind of ways that you could tell a project was an IPD project, regardless of the contract, and then strategies that we saw people using that might be similar even across very different sizes of projects. So, and then another thing that we were looking at is what motivated people to choose IPD as a project delivery method. When there are many other choices, why did they choose this particular way? So Paolo came to workshop with us for a week to set up the criteria of how we were going to look at these cases. And so what this is also repeated in the publication from in this one, Phil's. Sketched in these terms, design activity is not limited to what is defined as architecture, however broad that definition may be, but rather enters into all dimensions of the building procurement process. Opening it up in this way makes it plausible to turn architects' mental image of construction around so that they will think of the building process with all its ramifications as a system of design production independent of the profession. And so since we were dealing with integrated project delivery, this seemed to be a very useful way to look at things, because it was no longer all that important necessarily on who was the architect, who was acting as the contractor, and who was acting as engineer or other stakeholders or owner for that matter. So Paolo had a way of diagramming the way he had been following case studies for a number of years, and he actually has research students embedded in these projects for however number of years that they go on. And so these are documented with ways that they can measure, and the metrics change depending on which project they're looking at. This one happens to be the Sage Gateshead Music Center. And so they're usually public projects where there's a lot of records, and he just had this way of kind of mapping projects. And so over time he's built up a huge library of multiple projects. I won't go into this whole process, but this became very helpful for us in thinking about ways that we might, in our little mini 4-month project, map some of these things. So, okay, so we'll get into some of the projects here. So we are arraying these things so that you can look across and see, one project all the way through. Another way to look at it is if you look down the same parameter here of BIM, you can see that the Cathedral Hill Hospital, which is a really huge project with a lot of experienced IPD players, has extensive BIM protocols. These guys have, they're actually fairly new to the IPD process, so they're trying to adopt some of the AIA, like E202 BIM protocols. So they've got some things. These guys aren't really even using BIM. It's, not really important to the project. These guys are using BIM. Again, they're using a lot of things coming from other industries. This one happens to be AEC's consensus docs. And then this is the GSA, who have a lot of internal ways of working through the BIM process. But what we were trying to do, the project description is fairly straightforward. The IPD profile is where you start to get into some of the mapping that Paulo was interested in. We chose our own particular things that we were following, and these have to do with the motivations for why someone would choose IPD. So you can see this is a Bolt-Sutter collaboration. We're both very, very experienced in both Lean and IPD. So their market position is already established. They didn't choose to do IPD in this particular project because of market position. GSA, more well-rounded because some projects are IPD, some are really not. They have a bunch of their own contracts that make it difficult to really do the true multi-party agreements. But this particular Region 10 director was really well-rounded in his decision on why he chose IPD. They were also very driven by their schedule predictability because they were working with array funds or the stimulus funding, and they had to have contracts signed by people on a very short time frame. So they showed specifically why their old contract wouldn't work and they had to go to an integrated contract. These two projects are very small, and they really had no cost predictability, huge issues. Their schedule was perfectly manageable. Their risk was extremely low. It was a project type they'd done before. The technical complexity was also not very challenging, but they were primarily interested in market position. Essentially, they wanted to be able to say, we have done an IPD project. And if you look at the designs for some of these, you can see very low ambitions in terms of design, whereas some of these others, this was the only one that had any kind of name brand architect attached to it. This was James Cutler's working on the GSA with a number of with Sarah architects. And so you can see a little bit the level of complexity of the project and how that would relate to why they chose to pursue IPD. So we have a number of ways that you can compare them across that way. So I won't go into a lot of the others, but what is helpful is that we tried to identify the particular project types and things that they were using and how they framed their risk and reward. What we did find was the Cathedral Hill Hospital had a number of practices that were quite helpful in terms of teaming people. They would do things where in the team selection and the early planning, and they've been tracking actual cost benefits from the early involvement, and they were able to show how they have a number, and there's tons of acronyms in here. This TBD, there's a lot of lean jargon sprinkled in here as well, where they are having basically a cost estimator working directly with an architect, a subcontractor, and often an engineer. And so the architect is getting cost information almost live on their designs. And this architect was the Smith Group, and their feedback was that they felt it actually empowered them a great deal. So there was no kind of value engineering process. It was all being done live, and they were making the decision on what to prioritize if something was going over budget. There's other things that were interesting about some of the remodeling with early involvement, that if it was a project, it was an old building that they were adding onto, and because of the early involvement, they had subcontractors already under contract. An owner might say, that's kind of weird, I'm not going out to bid, I'm just signing up the subcontractor. And the subcontractors were hired based on qualifications, not based on bid. But they were so involved with the process that they actually found a lot of conditions, brought expertise to the table of saying, the mechanical engineer might want us to change something, and the mechanical sub would say, if you change it to that extent, you're no longer grandfathered under the old building, you're going to have to go for a new permit process because you're altering the system to a large extent. And then the engineer just said, oh, okay, we'll do it another way. And it ended up that they didn't have to go through that extra permitting process. So things like that happened on the renovation projects that I think was kind of a helpful way to show why the early involvement. I will say a couple of other things that, so we are missing this data. What happened is that we've got about 300 questionnaires from various team members. Some of these projects have, fairly large teams. These are FTE people. And so we were allowed to do a fairly extensive questionnaire to all of them on their things like, do you understand that there is shared risk and reward? Does that change your daily actions and daily decisions on this project? And so we're trying to figure out how deep is this stuff trickling down within the teams. And so given the 4-month deadline that we had to try to produce this stuff, we didn't get the chance to do that full analysis. But with the luxurious year that we've been given now for the second phase, we're hoping very much to get to that, as well as updating and seeing where people are over time. a great team that I worked with of mostly former students and current students. We also had a really helpful advisory board that we purposely chose to be interdisciplinary. So we had engineers, we had lawyers who were super helpful, especially when we had to get to the contractual part, trying to parse through pages and pages. We actually got the original contracts for all of these and trying to translate that into terms that we understood so that you could understand it, and also in this liability section was fairly dense, so we got a lot of consultation from some Shinura people as well as some legal people that are on the that are writing a lot of these contracts. So that's pretty much it. So I have 2 minutes left.
Okay, we'll give the 2 minutes. Give the 2 minutes to Dan.
We want to really encourage discussion and questions at this point. These are three dense and rich slices through the emerging challenge of authentic integrated design and practice pedagogy, observed from an industry perspective, from within the intimate experience of a authentically collaborative studio developed across departmental boundaries, and now a database that's emerging and I imagine will soon expand to include building performance. Seems like a logical direction. So I'm going to just step to the side, but I need to be here to be able to point to you to talk. So do we have a question or comment to open our discussion? Sir.
I'm wondering how much the development of these tools that we're talking about, in this case BIM, begins to predict the future role of the architect. And what I mean by that is, in my research with, let's say, some future systems, CBD tools or expert or knowledge-based systems, there's this indication that the knowledge and expertise that an architect brings to bear on a project would begin to be recorded in and utilized by the computational tools themselves. And similar to how BIM takes information and helps us manage that information, but begins to be filtered with pre-existing conditions and pre-existing information, which I would assume changes our role as architect. From your research and your look into these systems, how much is there talk going on about future systems, expert knowledge-based systems, people like John Giro and Yehuda Clay thinking of here, where we start sort of indicating a new role of the architect that basically is a manager of information as opposed to a master builder?
I guess I could answer that question from a couple of different perspectives, but I think probably the best one is as a business person. Because what we have to do as a business is speculate about where we think the profession is going, but not get too far out ahead of it. Because, not only because of sort of software production timelines, but also philosophically, one of my responsibilities is to make sure that our epistemological theory about how knowledge is organized in the building industry doesn't get too far ahead of what's happening on the desktops of our customers. What's happened in the BIM world is that the software manufacturers like us have been forced to assert a theory of knowledge about how buildings work, because that theory of knowledge doesn't really rigorously exist anyplace else that you can find it, right? I mean, the closest thing that we had in the AutoCAD age was a theory of graphic representation. But we don't have a real building epistemology, and software is very intolerant of that. So a lot of what we do is knowledge design structures. So from that perspective, and looking at the kinds of things that are going on technologically right now with primarily around cloud computing, which is essentially the two major technological constraints on the epistemological problem are storage and processing capability. Since those two things are eliminated, and there is now a kind of basic data structure in place, it now becomes possible to begin to not only record knowledge, but use it in a different sort of way. So for example, if Cary students were using our energy modeling tools, they would be processing their energy models outside of the studio. They download that stuff onto our cloud. Our cloud runs 33 scenarios and pumps the answers back in 2 minutes, right? That changes the very nature of the design process itself, because there's a direct interaction between manipulating the building form and seeing the energy results. And we're just at the very beginning of this. You can imagine a scenario where multiple algorithmic analytical tools are actually are parametrically affecting the resulting design. And I do believe ultimately that's where things are going. But I have to be careful not to get too hyperbolic about this, or we'll destroy our business. I mean, that's really what it boils down to. I have too many crazy ideas.
And some of it depends on, if it becomes this kind of highly integrated parametric algorithms, how much of that is transparent to the designer? How much of that are they manipulating, and how much of that are they just sort of trusting magically this is happening and they don't need to know?
My own philosophy of this is that you titrate those ideas by how dumb they are. What I mean is, the computer should be doing all the dumb stuff, right? Like, hey, dead end corridor, or hey, too much energy, or hey, the volume's too big. Not that looks, like Watson-esque, that looks less beautiful than it could be. That's going to be hard to do. But the dumb stuff, which creates, then you can take all those extra cycles and use them to design the building. Right. And that's that's my view of it.
I could bring in a few comments actually from organizational science. And one is the work of Steve Barley, who has studied technology in organizations. And he's done a really lovely piece that basically says technology is opportunity for change. So getting away from the idea that technology drives change and saying that it's an opportunity for change. And he's done numerous studies where he's seen comparable technologies being introduced. In some instances, the organization has changed as a result of that introduction. In some instances, they haven't. They've actually re-entrenched old roles, re-entrenched kind of their organizational divides. So I think given his experience in that, I think we could say we have paths we can take. The technology can enable us to do really interesting collaborations, or we can choose to not do them and still use technologies in old ways, and we have a choice. There's also kind of embedding, the idea of embedding knowledge in models. I kind of push back on that a little bit, because there is tacit knowledge and there is explicit knowledge. And the tacit knowledge you can't embed in software, I would argue. At least we can't figure out how to do that yet. So until Phil tells us otherwise, we're going to say that we can't embed tacit knowledge. So,
well, how about you shouldn't embed tacit knowledge?
So you can't. The architect is going to still have the knowledge of design and be able to carry that through the team. And that's why the talk is still so important, and conversation is so important part of the process.
I'm struck with an interesting conflict between this morning's address and this session, and talking about this breadth of knowledge. These architects, many of our graduates aren't going to go into the profession, and yet we all know there's this incredible amount of depth and specialist knowledge that one might need to assess and gain to kind of fully exploit all of these opportunities. And so the question I have, and I hope you don't take the easy route, which would be, well, if you don't learn this, then you're not going to have a job, right? And I think a real genuine questioning about what do design students really need to know, and what do they need to know about in their 5 years or 6 years in a professional degree.
Yeah, but I'm not, I don't know how you cram all those potatoes in that bag. I mean, it's, I was talking this morning with a colleague from McGill, and we were talking about this idea that there's this lack of a sense of urgency about this. The doctors have figured this out, because if they don't figure this stuff out, people die, right? But we haven't figured out any kind of logical structure that correlates your question. We've got multiple paths, multiple specialities, and no set of prescriptive outcomes about what we think is going to happen. And to make it worse, I think the situation is very dynamic. I don't think we're going to be able to prescribe with any degree of confidence exactly what an architect's going to be doing 10 years from now.
But it's very telling that you just said design students.
Yes, that's true.
That's one of 6 areas of analysis and competence that Phil just suggested we need to reconsider in the development of our curriculum. And design is a very promiscuous word that travels across our disciplinary boundaries into adjacent disciplines of profession. I think one thing we really need to be careful about is how we stabilize that term in our understanding. It has an inadvertently corrosive effect on our core mission.
But I do think that, I mean, that the potatoes never have fit in the bag. We've always wanted to do more than what we could do in the time we had or in the resources that we had. It's definitely getting more urgent because resources are dwindling, students are ever pressed for, you know, more time, and they're trying to get, you know, their LEED certification and all these other things going on. So it's never been the case that we have the luxury of saying, yeah, we have all the time in the world. You know, maybe when you look back at some of the Beaux-Arts days and it's like, you know, learn the courtyard, the dumbbell, and the bar building by the time you graduate. You know, but so I think that what needs to happen in curricula are strategies that talk about, you know, what are the core aspects of what we need to do, and what are the things that not all students are going to get all of. And so, you know, our students are coming in very different. They're not homogeneous coming in. And so we shouldn't expect that they're going to be homogeneous coming out. And it's hard for a lot of faculty to say, what do you mean some student is only going to get 4 weeks of urban design? And you say, yeah, there might be that student that doesn't choose to go on after they get just enough urban design so that you feel, okay, at least they're responsible for understanding the basic aspects of urban design. But if they end up doing something very different, there's no reason to have them sit through a semester-long class on urban design. So, you know, and I pick urban design, but it could be any number of things. So, but maybe architectural history is so core that everyone should have a full semester long of that. So how you decide to prioritize things, I think, is really critical. And then how you recast design. I mean, our Sacred Design Studio, if it's a studio that's like the one that Carrie described, does that count as one of the design studios? Or do the design faculty say, no, I need another design, a fully just design, architectural design studio? So I think it somewhat has to do with making us prioritize what's going on. But I do think if you have a program that's teaching professional practice that's not touching on these things, that's not responsible. So I think every professional practice class, and not just the required class, there needs to be professional practice electives. And unless that happens, I think we're doing a huge disservice to our students.
Especially in graduate programs, I agree.
I have some things, comments about the epistemological problem, and also one case where academia might actually be ahead of the profession and also ahead of the software people. We brought a software developer into the design studio, and we developed this concept of middle apps. In other words, more powerful than scripts, but less powerful than a full-blown software tool that had to do a lot of things for a lot of people. And we found that we were able to create completely open logical structures that actually created tools that developed almost like a hammer evolving into a violin through the design flow from schematic design to design development. And for instance, we developed this one tool where some person working with a cell phone in Bangladesh could take very complex masonry structures, listen to an MP3, follow the MP3, and produce a new kind of digital fabrication tool. Now that was like completely impossible before unless you had some expert coming right into the studio and creating things from the ground up. And my comment would be simply this, is that you could imagine that in the past, your ability to draw was a product of a sign of design competency. Now, the ability to program seems, and write tools from the ground up, we might have the architect and the software developer eventually merging into the same individual. And I'm sort of excited by this model, and I'm dying to get more software engineers into that level of pedagogy. Completely, the problem with a lot of the tools that we get, although we still use them, and they're still very vital, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. The problem with those tools is that they really do impose certain kind of structural epistemological limits that a creative look at any kind of problem could not possibly capture, nor would you want to replace with any kind of robot or expert system that creative spark. So it's like collaboration with the software engineers at that level, I think would be so exciting. And that's something I think that academia offers both the developers and the office people that I think this is the kind of discourse that could be developed.
I'm thinking back to changes in curricular structure and probably mostly thinking about graduate work where those folks that have had purview over the studio maybe feel a little bit invaded because other courses, and some of the courses might be a building systems integration course, or it might be the professional practice course, where students are undeniably doing design exercises. your course is getting so big that my students can no longer be in my studio because they're doing design projects, you know, in the professional practice course, or they're doing a design project in the, you know, the building systems course, or your materials course now does design build, and so I can't have them for my studio. And I've begun to realize that, well, essentially design is now filtrating out of the studio and is becoming solidly a process by which we understand these topics. And at a certain moment, I think we have to say, and what's wrong with that? I mean, it's a different model where we look at now that 50% of our degree curriculum are design, and we spend time thinking like, well, should we have urban design here, and then we should have, you know, the library design there, or we should have a kind of complex project here. But in fact, if we're teaching design as a process, it should be part of all of these bodies of knowledge. It should be the kind of agility that designers have to synthesize the kind of parameters of a project, so that they can sort of reflectively define what the project is and what are the possible opportunities for solving those projects. It's a collaborative exercise, and it's something that you see in coursework as we do course projects, because you usually do with someone else. But we don't see it so much in the studio. We have different discussions, it seems, about what should be the content of the studio. Yet when under fire, we would all say design process is the content of the studio. We know that it's migrated to other disciplines, and I think it's actually kind of a healthy thing as it finds itself situated in this other coursework. I think we have to rethink the curricular structure. Maybe there's actually more opportunity if we reorganize that 50% of the curriculum to be more useful, perhaps, to some of these competencies that Phil is suggesting, while still retaining some of the more traditional ones, whether they're visualization and parametric tools, or their visualization and putting together a presentation for lay people. Yeah, so just different thoughts, but.
So the glass half empty person would say design is nowhere, and the glass half full person would say design is now everywhere. And the one thing I would just say in terms of curricular reform is just be really careful about overloading the students. Anytime that there's an open-ended problem that requires lateral simultaneous thinking, whether it's for a structures class or a design studio, as soon as you open up that, it's a black hole for their time. And we know that. And it also inspires their passion, that they get really involved. So if you have 2 or 3 of those going on concurrently, and they're in teams, different teams for each one of those, these students cannot manage. They're not in an effective learning environment.
I'm still trying to internalize the whole idea of a professional practice course impinging on studio. It's just, in my 22 years of teaching professional practice, I've never heard that idea introduced before. So it's kind of thrilling in a way to hear people talk about it that way.
One of the quotes from the students last year, he comes out, he says, well, I'm just trying to get my head around how the engineer defines design. Like, it was a completely different way of talking and thinking with the same word design, and they kind of quickly learned that they used the same word. They used design, but they used it in really different ways to mean very different ways of thinking. So they learned that through just having to share a problem.
That's a great segue to the kind of question I have for the panelists, which is, having done a lot of these kind of projects with integration of various disciplines and throwing them together in somewhat stressful situations, and having different degrees of success depending on what the configuration was, one observation I had, and I'm curious if you all would concur, is that it comes down to the word intimacy. Smaller teams and more intimate, direct knowledge of exactly what people are doing seems to work better, and having a better clarity of a shared goal seems to actually add up to something. I'm wondering if, Renee, maybe you've seen any of that coming out of the professional examples and also carry out of the educational examples.
I mean, there are a lot of tools that the lean planning, last planner system, a lot of those things are kind of built in, coming from organizational management ways of thinking, that can be quite effective across very large teams. I think some of it has to do, in terms of the projects that we're following, is investment in early planning seems to be a huge predictor of success. And sometimes teams reported that a lot of people were kind of chomping at the bit waiting to get to the design. And someone, whoever was the champion was of IPD, said, no, we're team building. We're going to try to sort through our values. We're going to try to sort through our ways of working. We're going to sort through all of this stuff. And then the design process happens very quickly because we have a pretty deep knowledge of how we're working, how we're thinking, and what is this project really about. And they even do simple things like they put posters around the room to say, you know, what are our top goals? They have, you know, stuff that kind of required check-ins that people have to reaffirm. And I mean, some of it sounds kind of evangelical and a little scary, right? But it's about keeping large groups of people in some kind of coherent moving forward.
Yeah, I think you use the word intimacy, and I think of trust. So that trust is a big theme throughout any collaborative work. And how do you get that trust? Well, working closely in smaller teams, perhaps having conversations that build trust is important. But what we saw, even on the larger teams of our projects, that there would be clumping happening. So in our first studio, 8 teams of 8, they would actually clump up into teams of 2 and kind of do the deeper work, and then come back to the team for the group decision making that would happen.
Was it consistently the same groups of 2, or did they mix up?
They'll mix up a bit, but they would kind of have a habit I'm doing mechanical stuff, right. And so is my partner, so right. They would kind of take on scopes of work together. Typical of how you do it in practice too, right? Your mechanical engineer and your electrical engineer are going to sit down and put their heads together for a while, and so. Or mechanical, anyway, so lots of examples of how to clump up. So that's what we're seeing even in the bigger teams, the effective collaboration was happening when those smaller intimate teams are able to flexibly kind of come together and come apart. And I think that's where the integrated delivery contracting really helps, because it loosens the boundaries of who's able to talk to whom. So, you know, if the mechanical detailer is working through an issue, is able to just give the engineer a call without having to go through the chain of command, it's much more effective. After those lines of trust have been built, of course, because you need to document all the communication happening across organizational boundaries.
Not always. What we're finding is some of them had other ways of documenting that had nothing to do with the liability chain because they were under one.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Like the IPD loosens those documentation requirements.
They actually, some of them didn't document hardly at all.
Right. I mean, we on my IPD project where I was the client, we didn't have any working drawings. We just had a model, and the guys went out and built. We had permit drawings, but we didn't have any working drawings. They just used a model and went out and built the job. It was very interesting. Yeah. But I like this idea of intimacy because that's actually the kind of foundational idea of any of these integrated strategies. And I think you have to contrast that with the way a lot of us teach studio, frankly, which is here is the declarative brief, and you as the architect are going to assertively go out and do all this stuff, and you are unaffected by any of these other constraints. It's a completely different construct to be sitting around going, we're sharing this problem together. And the CM advisor actually has a valid point of view and occasionally even has a decent design idea.
Occasionally, Karen.
Only occasionally. I admit it.
The concern about where the direction of all this is going to, or whether the academy is giving a direction to this, I think, I'm not so sure coming from practice to the academy now that I'm so concerned about that. I am ultimately concerned that the academy doesn't gauge that. So innovation coming from the field seems natural to me, and maybe I'm phrasing this wrong. So that concern, but for me, coming from practice, I see the structure of how people access the programs to be the real problem, the cost and also the changing infrastructure. I'm teaching for 3 years and I have a 32-bit computer. My site license is 64, so I have useless technology very quickly.
Just so you know, every meeting I go to, somebody eventually gets to this question, so it's really not.
So my point is, I want to ask Carrie a question too, but isn't the point more like we should be inspired by the Twitter model, right? Where we invented it, Americans invented this kind of technology, and it was going to be this kind of playful thing, and it's been repurposed. So that kind of accidental use of technology is, I think, really, that is an attitude towards technology. That we take that, we're set. Then the next question is, in terms of collaborative, interdisciplinary work, in practice again, people plug in. It's nice, I mean, when I worked on a job where that we teamed and people stayed on the project all the way through, people that wouldn't normally, consultants that normally wouldn't come very early and stay very late, stayed in the process. But the problem of applying it in an academic setting is you've got these people that have to take a class and get credit, and how do you plug them in and out of the process so you don't give them this unrealistic view, because a consultant is going to work with 100 architects or 100 projects, where an architect's going to work on 2 or 3. So again, that's another structural issue that doesn't seem to be addressed in the model. I mean,
I think you're concerned about technological obsolescence. It's a structural characteristic of a time of accelerated innovation, and that's what we're in, and so that's life. However, the computing infrastructure is all going to cloud anyway, so you're going to be able to run everybody's stuff on your iPhone pretty soon, so I wouldn't worry about that. The problem I'm more concerned about, though, is I don't think this is a question of, I don't think this is a simple question of interesting things happening outside the academy. I do believe that the practice of architecture is rapidly being reinvented outside the boundary conditions of the academy. And I'm not so sure it's a good thing. I'm not so sure that you want just market forces to make all of those decisions for you.
This is exactly what our keynote speaker meant last night when she referred to neoliberalism.
well,
and the need to move beyond that model.
There's lots of big questions there.
Christine probably has the answer.
Yeah, well, I'd like to thank you all for a super thought-provoking session. It's just all these kind of mental explosions are going off and trying to make connections with things. I'm in a situation where I'm a dean of a faculty in the university. We share a campus with the Faculty of Engineering, got planning and architecture, hearing the issues around construction management. This kind of point about our internal boundaries within architecture programs, so the design, professional practice, and technology are somehow separated. So the first interdisciplinary barrier, I would think, for myself, is thinking internally to the architecture program. This kind of joint approach, crossing across these sort of territorial zones of courses. So that really made me think about that, this kind of professional practice, technology, design, and programming, even within the architecture, and of course widening it for external consultants, which is nothing new. It's been done a long, long, long time. And construction management, so that's great. The other thing I just wanted to touch on was this notion of design, and I think there is a key difference between the way architecture programs tend to think about design, which is hindering us, compared to the way that I'm seeing that word used in the broader university spectrum, under new banners like design and innovation, or the way engineers talk about design, or the way management faculties talk about design. And fundamentally, for these other faculties, design is a process, which it also is for us. So we assume some expertise around that. It has to do with interactive and feedback, and it's also values, whether we call it value engineering in a pejorative way, or we actually think about that more progressively. But there's value judgments based on this kind of response to feedback you're getting. So that aspect, I think, holds the greatest promise for us to have a shared language. I think where we run into our quicksand, our kind of personal morass, is when we reify design as something intrinsically interesting of itself. And we tend to do that because we make these objects that then we love the way they look. And I think that's a huge barrier. And when I try to get on these interdisciplinary discussions going, I find that architects feel they somehow own design, and design itself is an object of intrinsic study, like love or something. It becomes more problematic rather than a verb, which may have slightly different values attached to it and strategies attached to it, depending on these disciplinary frameworks that we talked about. But I think that you've really, these three presentations have really looked at that in the profession, in the conceptual framework, and in the practice of the studio.